So, without further ado, I introduce you to the Lady Librarian.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Joe. I'm very happy to welcome you tonight for our special program to kick off our Canal Side series. And we have a wonderful guest speaker. If you haven't heard Dr. Norman Dann speak before, you're in for a big treat. Not only is he a former professor from Morrisville, he is the author of numerous books, many of which, maybe all of which, he brought with him this evening. But he's going to be talking about his newest book, and that is about Gerrit Smith's wife. She has numerous names, Anne Carroll Fitzhugh Smith, and the title of the book is God, Gerrit, and Guidance, the Life of Anne Carroll Fitzhugh Smith. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Norman Dann.
Thank you, Liz. Good to be back, and always get a good crew here to speak with. I'm glad to be able to get out and talk to people about what's happened in Peterborough and the relevance of it to today. So I brought with me some of the things I've done. I know some of you have seen these books before, but very quickly, the biography of Gerrit Smith. This is the biography that was published about 10 years ago now. I have a revised version of that I have finished, and it's probably going to come out within a year or so. I've learned so much more since I did that one that I just needed to incorporate more stuff into it. So it'll be available later. Peter Smith is Gerrit's father. We did this one here a few months ago. Peter was the guy that was involved in the land dealings, land speculation with the Native Americans. He's the reason why we have Native American land claims right here today. And if you don't know what the legalistics of that are, it's all in there. It gets a little boring at times reading it. But the exciting part is Peter's life and what kind of a person he was and how he got so rich. He was a multi-billionaire, as was his son later on. The Cousins of Reform talks about Gerrit Smith and his first cousin, Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Their mothers were sisters, so that makes them very close relatives. And they became the two most powerful leaders of the two most important social movements for human rights in U.S. history. The abolition of slavery and women's rights. And the two most powerful leaders of those two movements learned their tactics with one another in Peterborough. She lived there with them when she was a teenager in the summertime. And she writes about that in her own autobiography. It's a fascinating story. And it also covers the emergence of the women's rights movement from the abolition movement. The abolition movement spawned the women's rights movement. And that's the story of that through their lives. Green Smith was Gerrit and Ann Smith's only son that lived to adulthood. He became an ornithologist and a nationally known sportsman and conservationist. He proposed the first, what were called fish and game laws for the state of New York that were adopted by the legislature. Right on the cutting edge of that whole movement. Elizabeth Smith Miller was Anne and Gerrit's daughter. She became involved in the women's rights movement, especially in dress reform and suffrage. And lived in Peterborough until 1869 and then moved to Geneva down on Seneca Lake. When We Get to Heaven is the story of the Underground Railroad as it relates to Peterborough. So if you have any interest in those are available here. Tonight we're going to be talking about Anne. As you indicated, Anne Carroll Fitzhugh Smith. And to talk about women that lived in the 1800s and before, they weren't even supposed to exist in some ways. You realize that? The discrimination against women in the 1800s was intense. It was so intense that many people believe that it was more intense than the discrimination against blacks and slaves. Now think about that one. There were 4 million slaves in 1860, around when the Civil War started. There were 15 million women. There is a much bigger chunk, half the population, and the discrimination against them was so intense that outside of the domestic sphere in the home, they didn't have much to do. Men simply wouldn't let them. Their identity was through males. You lived in the shadow of some male if you were a woman, and you were identified with him. And when you go to look up something about Anne Carroll Fitzhugh Smith, you can't find it. Because that's not how it's listed. She was Mrs. Garrett Smith. And you've got to start looking around there, and you still don't find much because they didn't make the papers. You look in the old newspaper files, and you can do that online these days, and you find a lot about Green Smith and Garrett Smith Miller, and Peter Smith even, because there were newspaper articles written about them. How about the women? I searched and searched and searched through old newspapers for something about Anne Smith. And once in a while I find something that referred to her, but not as Anne Carroll Fitzhugh Smith. It was always Mrs. Garrett Smith or Garrett Smith's wife. That's almost a derogatory term in some ways. I think sometimes it still is. I have people that talk to me these days, and I always try to shoot back at them. And they say something, well, I said to the wife, I told the wife this, and I say, excuse me, the wife? What's that? That sounds like some sort of a tool, like a hammer or a saw or a car. You use it to do something. Isn't this a person? Think about that, and maybe you'll hear that. But the discrimination is still there. That's the point. So when you go to do some research on women in those days, it's very difficult because they don't appear in the papers, either in the newspapers or in the papers in the libraries. If you go to Syracuse University, where the Smith family papers are, you can go to the Garrett Smith papers, and it's voluminous. There's 155 boxes of just written materials, and then maps and deeds and all kinds of stuff. You can also go to the Green Smith papers, the ornithologist. There's a separate part on him. You can go to the Garrett Smith Miller papers. He was Garrett and Anne's grandson. There is a big section of the papers on just him. But if you want to research Anne or Elizabeth, their daughter, they're on the papers. Oh, they're there. But they're filtered in, mixed in with all of the papers for the males. So the letters that Anne wrote are in the Garrett Smith papers or the Green Smith papers. See? So, and nothing was written on these people. When I started researching, the only person here that had much written on him already was Garrett and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. She had quite a bit done on her. But for Green Smith, nothing had been done on him. That's the first biography of Green Smith. Peter Smith, the guy that made you sign your deed by saying that you understand that you don't own the land, that the Native Americans still have. You have to sign that caveat on your deed these days. Nothing written on him. Nothing. I figured I'd run into other articles or something written on Peter Smith. No, nothing written on Anne. The only thing written on Anne before this is a chapter I put in the Practical Dreamer, the biography of Garrett. So I did a little bit there with her. This obviously is much more extensive. So, researching women from the 19th century, it's a problem because they weren't considered to be important. And they may, in some ways, have been much more important than the males. And you'll see how as we go through this. The Fitzhugh connection. Who were the Fitzhughs? Anne was born in Hagerstown, Maryland. The Fitzhugh family started off in this country by Anne's great-great-grandfather migrating here in 1673 to the state of Virginia. Anne isn't born until 1805, so they lived in the state of Virginia for quite a while. The Fitzhugh family lived there until 1752, about 80 years, before Anne's grandfather, her great-great-grandfather was William Fitzhugh from England, came over in the 1600s. Her grandfather was William D. Fitzhugh, and he moved from Virginia to Maryland in 1752. Ann's father, William, you get it? William. There were 5 Williams. And when people refer to William Fitzhugh without using the middle initial or some sort of a date, you don't know which one it is. So it's difficult to sort this stuff out when you're going through the papers, unless there's some sort of a clue like that tells you which William it might be. Ann's father was William Frisbee Fitzhugh. He was born in 1761, became a Maryland state legislator, a well-known man in a wealthy family. They were all slaveholders in Maryland. All of the Frisbee family, Williams, were slaveholders. So this is Ann's upbringing in a slaveholding family. Her father married Ann Hughes in 1771 and developed a 1,200-acre farm near Chewsville, C-H-E-W-S, Chewsville, Maryland. I'm told by the people in Chewsville, I've been there, that that's a corruption of Fitzhughville. And it sort of got slurred around and came out as Chewsville eventually. Anyway, it's just about 6 miles from Hagerstown. Hagerstown, Maryland is in the western panhandle of Maryland. You can picture Maryland with that little narrow part that squeaks over past West Virginia. Way over there, it's in the western part of Maryland. It's not near the ocean. So that's where she came from. And around 1800, her father, William, is aware that slavery is probably going to end soon. And he wasn't so sure that it was a great idea anyway, so he was looking for some way out of this. He owned 61 slaves. I mean, this was not a small slave owner to help him on his 1,200-acre farm. So he was a fairly large slave owner. The bigger plantations in the South had more. But that was for the northern areas. That was a large slaveholder. And so he, with 2 of his friends that lived in Hagerstown, they started a bank. So they became business partners in the Hagerstown Bank. And his 2 friends were Charles Carroll and Nathaniel Rochester. Now there's a name you've heard. They started in the early 1800s investigating land plots in upstate New York to which they could move and get away from slavery. And they investigated and eventually purchased in 1803 what was called the 100-acre tract on the Genesee River, which is now the city of Rochester. They founded the city of Rochester, and it was named for Nathaniel Rochester, one of the 3. He was the one that went there first. They purchased it in 1803, and Nathaniel Rochester moved to that area, frontier. Nothing going on there, it's woodland. In 1803, and he started surveying and mapping and some small development. And the other 2, William Fitzhugh and Charles Carroll, waited until after the War of 1812 had ended, which was going on in upstate New York. At that point, in 1815, they sold their slaves and their land. And William Fitzhugh sold 61 slaves, and Charles Carroll sold over 40. So they were both pretty well-heeled slave owners. And then they moved to the Rochester area, both of them in 1817. So when they moved to the Rochester area, Anne is 12 years old. She was born in 1805. So her first 12 years were spent on a slave holding plantation, I guess you could call it. Would have been a small one, but it's important because this is the mentality she developed. She was reared by a black nanny and grew up understanding the social characteristics of slavery and the discrimination that goes along with that. So where does Gerrit Smith come in here? Smith is living here in Peterborough. He graduates from college in 1818, Gerrit. He went to Hamilton College, and he graduates in 1818, and he comes home to Peterborough intending to go on in school and become an attorney. But he didn't do that, and the reason he didn't do that was that the day after he returned from 4 years of college in Clinton, his mother died. It was very unexpected. His mother died of cholera, which was not uncommon at the time. Cholera is a disease that caused by dirty water. You know that, we know the cause of it, but it wasn't known that. The cause of cholera was not discovered until 1854. Yeah, Garrett Smith had been alive for 57 years before the people discovered that the fact that he was drinking water out of the brook was not a good idea. And the most common physical ailment that shows up in letters, I've read thousands of letters between these family members, the most common physical ailment is called disordered bowels. Well, what are you drinking? See, that's what causes it. And they had no idea that that was the cause of it. She wrote to him, Anne wrote to Garrett one day when she was away and said to him, "My dear, I have not had diarrhea for 12 days. What a wonder. What a wonder." I mean, would you have to live with that? Yeah, they did. They lived with it. And they didn't know the cause. So, his mother dies of that when he comes home from college. And he then has to take over his father's business, which he did not want to do. He didn't want to do that. He didn't want to be a land baron. He wanted to go on and become an attorney, but he never did that. And the story of that is in the other book. You can read that and figure out all the details of why it happened that way. But so if he's here in Peterborough, and Anne Carroll Fitzhugh is way out there in Rochester, what's the connection? I'll tell you. This one you've got to follow closely. When Garrett graduated from college, he had a college sweetheart that he had met there. Her name was Weltha Backus, and she was the daughter of the college president, Hamilton College president at the time. They married in 1819, shortly after he graduated. And 7 months later, she died. She died of what you and I would recognize as encephalitis, fluid on the brain, and nobody knew what to do about it. We could treat these things these days, but they didn't know what to do, and she died. When he was married to Weltha Backus, he met her family, the Backus family, who lived in Rochester, most of them. And her brother, Weltha's brother, Frederick Backus, who was a fairly well-heeled physician in Rochester, married Rebecca Fitzhugh, Anne's sister. Now you get it? So if you follow all that, Weltha Backus's sister, Weltha Backus's brother, Frederick, I get confused, married Rebecca Fitzhugh. So therefore, Garrett meets the Fitzhugh family through Rebecca. One of her sisters is Anne. And when he met her in Rochester, she was 13 years old. And 3 years later, they married. So she was 16 years old when Garrett married Anne Carroll Fitzhugh. She was 1 week shy of her 17th birthday. And many of the reports on her say she was 17 years old because they're looking at the year instead of the date. She was actually 16, but close. So that's the connection. And the marriage between Garrett and Anne was a good one. I say that with care because it's tough to define a good marriage in that it is referred to by Garrett's previous biographers in glowing ways. I mean, this is a wonderful, loving, peaceful relationship for the 50-some years that they were married. And the biographers say that even some of his acquaintances and friends did. William Lloyd Garrison, the abolitionist from Boston, wrote glowingly of this match made in heaven that was so beautiful. In the research I did, you find out that it was a very complex relationship. What is it, right? And they had their problems. They had a midlife crisis. They weren't sure they ever should have gotten married. They didn't divorce. Well, that was sort of taboo in those days, especially for upscale families like the Garrett Smiths. So you just didn't do this, unless it was an extreme case, and it wasn't. So, but they did have their difficulties, but managed through it okay in the long run. And the most important thing about the relationship between Anne Fitzhugh and Garrett was they were friends. They were good friends all their lives. And good friends sometimes get angry at each other and help each other, and that's the way it was. But she was always there for him and he for her. So they had some problems, but it was a good marriage in that way, and that they worked them out and stayed together and had a fruitful life together. She appreciated the finer things in life, as you might suspect a rather domestic and idle woman would. She liked music, especially opera. She did a lot of travel. We'll get to that in a few minutes. But when she traveled, she frequently went to the opera because she loved to go so much. She always dressed in white, and the picture that I did put on the cover shows her with a white top on. She liked white dresses and shawls because it reflected to her some kind of purity of soul that she liked to express. Her orientation toward life was as a subservient person. Now that makes sense. Just think about her upbringing. She came off that slave plantation where women were sort of invisible. And she adopted that attitude for the rest of her life. And in that subservient role, it was a domestic kind of role. Garrett called her at one point her pale flower, quote, pale flower. There's not much power in a pale flower, I don't think, at least conceptually. And that's what the facts were. She was a kind person and had philanthropic attitudes, meaning benevolence, orientation toward helping other people when she could, but she didn't have much for resources. They were with her husband, and he had it locked in. He wouldn't let his family have money beyond what he determined that they needed. Garrett was, in your and our terms, a multi-billionaire. He could have purchased anything he wanted at any time. But he didn't want the money, and he didn't want to let his family have the money. He kept them well heeled. Even relatives that were in Peterborough, he helped them to the tune of thousands of dollars a year because simply he had it. But none of them were considered wealthy in the long run because he limited what he allowed them to have. And so Anne never had a huge resource pool from which she could go about doing good deeds until late in her life. And she died in 1875, and it was in the late 1860s, Garrett allowed her to have her own bank account. And I say allowed with all of the power and implications of that. And she had an account with a few $1,000s in it, in those days dollars, which was a lot of money. And she did the same thing with it that he did. She gave it away to other people. So she had the same, I call it the caring gene, that he did. One of the most frequent questions I get when we talk about Garrett, and maybe from Anne too as time goes, is how come they did that? Why were they kind and benevolent like that? Why were they philanthropic? How come they gave away so much money? Why would anybody do that? Well, there's a lot of potential explanations of that. Their religious ideas, guilt, I don't know what the real answer is. I tried both of them, those and others, in the biography of Garrett. I think the real answer is genetics. That's coming. It's new. I've thought this for many, many years. I taught sociology in college, and I was always a little bit disappointed with what was called the behaviorists. Did you run into that in any of your college work, the behaviorists in psychology? everything is learned, you know, Watson and Skinner and others were along those lines. Everything in human life is learned. We can make anybody into anything we want to. That was great for a while, and people believed it. I don't think so. I think that people are hardwired for a lot of things that we're beginning to see as very real now. One of which is benevolence and kindness and caring for other people. Some people just don't give a rat's about others, and some do. Now, how do you explain that? And it may not be even running in families. Peter had no benevolence. Garrett's father, he was a harsh, difficult to like man that was greedy, a money grabber, and really didn't care much about other people. And look at his son. Gave away everything he ever could. And then Garrett's son, Green, was like Peter. So it isn't an automatic transfer of the genes, but if you happen to, maybe it's recessive, huh? I don't know. But if you happen to end up with it, it's a whole mental orientation to people that is very different than most others. And it entails a lot of sacrifice. And you don't have to be rich like Garrett to be a philanthropist. I like to make that point. These two people, Ann and Garrett, were rich. They had a lot of money to give away, and they did. But you don't, everyone has a resource. You have a resource. I have a resource. We can give that away. We can donate that. We can make other people better off because of what it is we know or can do. So you can be philanthropic as well, perhaps if you have that caring gene. And there's an ad on TV now that the basis of the ad is, do you have the caring gene or not? I like that one. Probably won't last long on TV, but it's there right now. So she was that kind of a person, along with her husband. They had 7 children. Anne had 7 children, 2 of which have biographies here. Where are the other 5? Dead early. That was a tough time to stay alive, especially for children. If you made it to about age 20, the chances were you could probably make at least another 20. Go to a graveyard around here that's from the 19th century and look at the gravestones and see how many of them say died age 32, age 6, age 12. I mean, it was rare that somebody reached age 70. Very rare. So 3 of their children died in infancy of causes I don't know nothing about. One of them was a young girl that died at age 5 from some kind of complications with convulsions. I'm not sure what it was. It could have been epilepsy. And another one was a young male that died at age 12. His name was Fitzhugh, named for the family. And he died at age 12 of dysentery. You know how fast dysentery can kill? Maybe 3 days. I mean, if you become dehydrated, you die very quickly. And that's what that does. That's what happened to him. And nobody could stop it. There were no medications for it. So the only 2 children that they had that lived to adulthood were Green, the ornithologist, and Elizabeth, the women's rights person. But think of that. And you'll find Garrett, the most powerful abolitionist in the country. There's much agreement on that among scholars these days. Green became a nationally known ornithologist and sportsman. And Elizabeth, a nationally known women's rights advocate for suffrage and dress reform. All from one family. So that transferred to the children that lived. They also had other children. Now, how do you do that? They had 7 of their own, 2 of which lived. Between 1825 and 1829, that's over 3 years it was, they had 8 children of the Cochranes. The Cochranes were Peter's daughter's children. Peter Smith, Garrett's father, had a daughter named Cornelia. She had 8 children and died at age 33. Men at the time were not expected to rear children. So her husband, Mr. Cochrane, was not expected to keep these kids. What do you do with 8 children? They were all young children. You give them to somebody else. So they did. Garrett and Ann volunteered to take them in, and they lived in Peterborough with the Smiths for 3 years, all 8 of them, along with their own children. They also, between 1838 and 1841, had 2 children from the Burney family. Well, who's that? James Gillespie Burney was a slaveholder turned abolitionist who became acquainted with the Smiths through the Liberty Party. The Liberty Party was the 3rd political party that was established actually in Peterborough, the first meetings, and eventually morphed into what is currently the Republican Party. At the time, they were the radical human rights liberals. That's not so anymore, but that's the way it was then. And he was the presidential candidate for that party in 1840 and 1844, and Garrett was one of the founders, so he knew these people. And when Bernie's wife died, they took over his children, 2 of them, for 3 years. Yeah, how many times you want to do this? And then later on, they took on, between 1841 and 43, they took on 1 additional child from Peter Shenandoah Smith's family. That was Peter Smith's first son, or Garrett's brother. With me? So Garrett's brother, his wife died. And he did, I don't want to take care of the kid, so Garrett took it. Wow. Yeah, they had children around a lot. And Anne liked it. So it was, she was a domestic type person, and this was okay with her. But it was a charge on them in many, many ways for a long time. How about Anne's health? That's always an important aspect of a person's life, obviously. Medical technology in the 1800s was, could we call it primitive at best? I mean, Welther died of encephalitis. Their son Fitzhugh died of dysentery. I mean, these things, you can go to the drugstore and get stuff over the counter for some of these things now. But when medical technology was so poor, nobody understood the causes of these things. People died. You could get a cold and die. That's what happened to Green. Green Smith, I've told you all of the things he did. He had, in the birdhouse, which is pictured on the cover of the book, he had almost 3,000 mounted birds, which he mounted. He was the taxidermist. It was the largest collection of mounted North American birds in the United States at the time in Peterborough. And he died when he was 38 of pulmonary problems. He caught a cold, and it eventually went into tuberculosis, and he died. Well, you've got TB these days, you're probably going to be okay after a while, because there are antibiotics, I call them horse pills, you know, big doses of antibiotics, and you're probably going to survive that. Well, those days, people didn't know what to do. One of the things that generally upper-class women like Anne found was that if they were sick, they got more attention. So, being what Anne called, this is cute, comfortably sick, was a regular thing with her. And she would write to Garrett and say, she was away a lot, I'll tell you why in a few minutes. She would write to Garrett and say, please don't worry about me, dear. I am sick, but I'm only comfortably sick. What did that mean? Well, it meant, I think, that she was probably a hypochondriac and had figured out ways to whine and complain enough so that she got attention. That helped, because in her real life, she did not get much attention. So this was a technique that sort of a backdoor way of figuring out how to get what she wanted. And so she was prone, therefore, to a lot of miracle cures that were making the market those days. There were movement cures, water cures, and there were fads that came up in the middle of the 1800s. Movement cures were simply exercise. What kind of movement can you do? And if you do this, it'll cure that. If you do something else, it'll cure something else. And people were making a lot of money at these things. And the naivete of the generally comfortably sick person was that this is going to work. So they would do it and pay a lot of money for it. The average cost of these cures, I finally figured out, was about $9, about $9 a week in those days dollars. Multiply that by 70 to figure out what it means. And they were paying $630 a week for cures, and they'd go and stay at these facilities for months. Yeah, so it's a pretty significant cost that they were incurring just because they were comfortably sick. And the travel to do it. You see, these facilities, the water cure was an interesting one. There was a big one down in Dansville, New York, which was run by a guy named James Caleb Jackson, who used to live in Peterborough. James Caleb Jackson was the guy that wrote the first-hand account of the trip from Utica to Peterborough on the night of October 21st, 1835, when the meeting in Peterborough was broken up, the anti-slavery meeting, and they took the packet boat to Canastota and then walked up the oxbow to Peterborough in the rain and mud. It's a fascinating story, and the first-hand account of that was written by James Caleb Jackson. He was one of those people. And eventually he left Peterborough. He lived in Peterborough for about 6 years. And when he left, he went to Dansville and opened up a water cure. What's a water cure? Well, you use water for health reasons in any fashion you can figure out, and boy did they figure out a lot of them. You could use cold water cure this, hot water cure that, running water did this, tepid water was used to control diet, steam for something else, ice for something else. I mean, any form of water could be used to cure something. And it was believed, people believed it. So they go and spend months at a water cure or a movement cure and hope to feel better. And you know, the old placebo effect, I expect that if they expected to feel better, they probably would. Especially if you're only comfortably sick, right? So these things worked, and people kept going back. And she went to water cures. Anne loved water cures, and she went to water cures in New Jersey, in Albany, in Dansville, all over, Clifton Springs. She went all over the different water cures, spending months at a time there, away from home, hoping to feel better. And you got to realize that she could do this because their affluence allowed it, and her hypochondria encouraged it. So being depressed about one's health leads to these kinds of attitudes that Garrett was disgusted with. Garrett was a very practical thinker, practical dreamer, title of the book, and he didn't think she was sick. You know, he'd go along with her. He'd say, yeah, okay, you need to go to Clifton Springs for a month and a half for a water cure. Here's the money. Go ahead and keep writing to me every day. And boy, they did. It's good things, a lot to read and hopes to learn about. And but he called it, she's in Clifton Springs trying to work out the maggots in her brain. That's his quote. He was cynical about it, see? And she felt that too, which probably didn't happen. But maybe she had maggots in her brain. He thought she had something like that. How was she relative to religion? I think that's an interesting topic for anybody, for us to investigate. One's ideas and attitudes about religion, I think, reveal a lot about the person. And Green, for instance, was very secular. He didn't care anything about religion. He was a scientific-minded person. He became a citizen scientist and a very powerful and important one in his lifetime, especially in ornithology. But he didn't care about religion. That bothered his mother and father a lot. He was a rebel, and he gave them problems in rearing. But when you learn something about a person's attitude about religion, I think there's a lot in there to say something about them. Religion, as I'm sure you know, has a lot of easy answers for complex problems. It's God's will, maybe, or something like that. And it rationalizes tragedies. I'm fond of saying the world is full of simple, easy to understand wrong answers. And probably those are some of them. That it makes it easy, and it also makes you feel better. So there's a psychological function going on here in religion that is very important, and it's important to feel better. So it has some positive effects, for sure. Well, Anne liked it, and she was very susceptible to religious ideas and trends. And this was at a time, it's strange, at a time in the 1840s when Green was growing up, that science was exploding. In the 1840s, 50s, 60s, the scientific investigation process, the scientific method, you studied that in school, that was just coming in. And man, it was amazing. Garrett was enthralled with it and thought that science would eventually explain everything. You'd never need religion. He became eventually a very secular person because of that. And I'll say more about that here in just a minute. But Anne just couldn't adopt the scientific, the deductive kind of reasoning. She was an inductive reasoner, if that means anything to you. That was very opposite to what Garrett was. And she became interested in the 1840s in spiritualism. Spiritualism was a brand of religion that believed that after death, the soul lives on. And you can communicate with it. If you can develop the right kind of a trance, and anybody could, you didn't need a special intermediary, anybody could develop the right kind of a trance to communicate with lost people because their souls still lived. So this was attractive to Anne because she had lost some children that she wanted to talk to. And there were various types of it. One of them that most people are familiar with was the rappings. And there were some fraudulent folks like the Fox sisters that developed techniques of making rapping sounds and claiming they were talking with the dead. And Anne would sit, Garrett wrote poems about it that were very critical about his wife. She would sit at a desk with a pen in her hand waiting for the spirit to push it and write messages to her. So she was deeply into the belief in spiritualism. And this was at a time, like I said, when science is advancing. So something's holding her back, you see? What is it? Remember her rearing? That attitude structure she came up with? It's in there. And also going on were some interesting trends in religion that Garrett was involved in. And she's a supporter of him. She always had his back. So she's there and she's knowing these things and she's supporting him, but skeptically a little bit, see? So, and one of them was involved in the Free Church. You've probably heard of the Free Church before. It was an abolitionist idea in the late 1830s when the abolition movement was really heating up in central New York. The main denominations, all the denominations of Christianity were pro-slavery. That shocked some people, even Catholicism, all of them. Whether you're talking about what sect, Lutherans, Baptists, Methodists, all of them were pro-slavery to some extent. And Garrett, of course, knows this, and he says, phooey. I want a place of worship, but I can't go to any of those. What are we going to do? You start another one. You start your own. And it was called the Free Church, meaning it was free from any sectarian identity. It had no doctrine. Got it? So it wasn't Presbyterian or Lutheran or anything, and you had to believe certain doctrines. It was just a free church, and anybody could be a member. Anybody that wanted to come and sit down was a member. And there were many of them. The Free Church movement sort of blossomed in the early 1840s. And Garrett started one in Peterborough. There was one in Casanova, one in Hamilton, one in Oswego. They were all around. And it was really a type of anti-slavery evangelism because the church was oriented toward the abolition of slavery, and its preachers, if you could call them that, they weren't really ministers, were anti-slavery or abolitionist people. And they would go into the church and deliver a lecture, call it a sermon if you want, on anti-slavery politics. What? You merging politics and religion? Yeah, that's what they did. The Free Church became a forum for anti-slavery politics. And the people that spoke in the Free Church in Peterborough, William Lloyd Garrison, Charles Sumner, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, John Greenleaf Whittier, all abolitionists, and they had a political message to deliver to you. So it was almost like an anti-slavery society, the Free Church was. And this was going on at the same time as Anne is this very devout religious person, and she was supportive of it. So she was there in some ways. Another thing that was going on at the time, and this was in the 1850s, was Gerrit Smith's idea of what he called the religion of reason. It took me a long while to figure this one out. What he meant by the religion of reason was that through people's ability to reason and have good judgment, you can figure out what is best for humanity. You don't need some authority figure in a church telling you this. That insults intelligence. So all you need to do, you want a good metaphor for it, a good example of it, look at nature. You look at the natural world and you see balance. A lot of forces operating in nature, as you know. If you're any kind of a budding ecologist, you probably looked at these kinds of things. Most people have in one way or another. And there are a lot of biotic and abiotic factors in an ecosystem, right? Biotic living things, abiotic non-living things, they're all in balance. All in flux all the time. It's always moving, but it's balanced. As long as we leave it alone. When we screw it up, pardon me, with pollution, then things go wrong. But as long as it's left alone, it will be in balance. And there is violence in there, and there is love in there, put it one way or another, but it's in balance. Well, Gerrit said, human society could be the same. There's a lot of diversity in nature, a lot of diverse species. The more diversity, the more balanced it is, right? The higher the diversity, the better the balance. A cornfield is not balanced because it's a monoculture. It's all one thing. So you got to do something like add poisons to keep the bugs out. Well, you don't have to do that in a swamp. It's all balanced. So he said human society can be the same way. We've got a lot of different species of people, types of people. And as long as we realize that we're all persons, an important point, then we can see one another as equal and balance out relationships. It was a great idea. Great idea. One of his fundamental points in life, two of them maybe. One was there's only one rule for human life, and that's the golden rule. You know what that is. And the other one was everyone is a person. You're a person. You're a person. I'm a person. You're a person. That makes us all equal. But wait a minute. You're a person that's male. You're a person that's female. There's a person that's black. There's a person that's, what? Old. We add labels. And the labels emphasize differences. You with me? And the differences lead to discrimination. So Smith's idea was, cut it. Don't add the labels. See the person first. Neat idea. And once you do that, you see equality, and then you can help produce balance. So that was his religion of reason. And he wrote about it. It's a book about it he wrote. And Anne knew what it was all about, and she was behind him with it. So she was having a lot of dissonance here, I think, between her mental state of accepting authority. She loved the Bible and its tenets and the teachings that were in there. And she liked the Bible is a book that degrades women. I hope I'm not telling you something new. It's very discriminatory against women. Elizabeth Cady Stanton wrote a book entitled The Woman's Bible because she was trying to counteract that discrimination that's coming out in the Christian Bible. And another person that wrote a lot about it was Matilda Jocelyn Gage, the Fayetteville resident. She wrote some really tough stuff on the discrimination of Christianity against women. And
What year were they writing this? Like 1840?
no, these writings were coming out in the 1890s.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Yep. But later than the mid-century. So the whole effort was to attract people's attention to what it is that is discriminating against women. Where is this coming from and how is it reinforced? Well, that's obviously one of the major ways in which it's reinforced, is through Christianity. It still is. So it's a you know, where are women in the priesthood? They're beginning to make a few inroads here and there, but very, very grudgingly. So her attitude toward religion was essentially that she appreciated the presence of authority and was willing to listen to it and carry out. That's the guidance thing, you know. Garrett, guidance. She became like a guidance counselor. Her reform efforts were for herself and her family, not institutionally. Garrett's out there pounding on the legislatures. Ann is pounding on green. See? Big difference. Big difference. She did get involved in the human rights movements, however. And it's fair to look at what she did and how she supported the work of Garrett in the abolition movement, the women's rights movement. And she was the main hospitality agent in the house in Peterborough. Got it? That house in Peterborough, there's pictures of it here, was an amazing place. It was, William Lloyd Garrison called it a hallowed place. It was what I call a group therapy unit for abolitionists and women's rights advocates who got beat up frequently on the speaking circuit. If you were an abolitionist in central New York, number one, you were disliked intensely because business persons and politicians saw you as interfering with their profits. A lot of people in the North had big investments in slavery, and they didn't want to see it end. In fact, it didn't end in New York State. New York State was the last state in the Northeast to abolish slavery. New York State had more slaves than Georgia. Yeah, that's true. So it was a big deal here, and if you were an abolitionist, you were in trouble. Especially if you went over here to Utica to speak. You better wear a vest that protects you, because you were probably going to get hit with rocks, rotten eggs, bottles, just because you went to that agency to make a speech about abolition. Henry Brewster Stanton, Elizabeth's husband, was beat up to the point of bloodiness over 150 times on the speaker circuit and kept going back to do it. And that was not unusual. And they would need some rest and relaxation. And they came to Peterborough to get it, because they understood that the resources were there for not only just rest and relaxation, but psychological rekindling and money so that they could recharge their batteries and go back out on the circuit again. The house was an important place. That's what I'm getting at. That house in Peterborough was a marvelous respite for women's rights and abolition advocates. And Anne supported all of it. She was there managing the house. She was like a first lady, managing the house. Who did she help? I made a partial list. John Brown, Frederick Douglass, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, Harriet Tubman, James Gillespie Birney, William Lloyd Garrison, Henry Highland Garnett, Theodore Dwight Wells, Sojourner Truth, Salmon P. Chase, William Sumner, Joshua Giddings. I don't know where your American History Index leads you, but those are all huge names out of those books. They are the leaders of abolition in the United States, and they all came to Peterborough. All of them. And Anne was there to help them with hospitality. She supported the Free Church. I guess that's a fire, isn't it? Is that what that is? I hope no one's heard of it.
Fire or an accident?
We've just said, what I'm doing is, how did she support abolition? Right? That's one way, through her hospitality. The Free Church, she supported the Free Church, and the Free Church was a major institution politically for the abolitionist movement. She supported the Liberty Party. We mentioned that briefly. The Liberty Party was started by 4 people, and it was Garrett Smith, James Gillespie Birney, who we've mentioned, Alvin Stewart, who was a lawyer from Utica, and Myron Holly. 4 guys. They met in Garrett Smith's house in Peterborough in 1839 and decided to form a third party to propose abolition of slavery because the 2 major parties wouldn't do it. The 2 major parties were the Whigs and the Democrats. No, they're not going to take up slavery as an issue. So these people that were interested in abolition said, well, that's great, we'll start our own party. So that's what they did, and they called it the Liberty Party. Eventually, over the next decade, it morphed, along with other third-party interests, into what became the Republican Party, as we mentioned just a few minutes ago. So, she supported that. This is a major effort at the elimination of slavery, and Anne was there, and she was supportive of it. She supported the boycott of slave-produced products. Starting in 1836, there was an effort on the part of some abolitionists to boycott all of the products of slavery. Okay? Now, what would they be? Cotton, fabrics, rice, tobacco, right? And other sugar from cane, products made by slave labor. And they boycotted them. It worked sort of for a little while, but it was not popular and eventually died out. But it made for some difficult times in the home for domestic people like Anne, who were keeping the home up. But she supported it, and then that was a major effort on her part. She supported the purchase of the Russell family. That's a story, if you haven't heard it, it's sort of quick. I can do it quickly. Anne, as you know, was reared in a slaveholding family. She was reared by a black nanny in Maryland. Her black nanny's name was Harriet Sims. When Garrett became a wealthy abolitionist, Anne gave him an assignment. Find Harriet Sims, buy her, and bring her to Peterborough and freedom. Oh, he loved this. Garrett liked to see quick, tangible evidence of his philanthropy, and this was a great opportunity. So he hires a friend of his, sends him south with a blank check, find Harriet Sims, buy her, and bring her home. They did. They found her as still a slave, living on a plantation in Kentucky. She had become married. Her name was Harriet Sims Russell, and she had a husband and 5 children. So what do you do with all them? You know what Garrett said? Buy them all. The money didn't mean anything. So they did, and the slaveholder, fortunately, was willing to sell. So they bought all of them and brought them to Peterborough to freedom. And many of them were employed in Peterborough, either on the Garrett Smith estate or in other businesses around. And Harriet became the Garrett Smith family laundress and worked for years in the building on the estate that is now called the laundry. So if you ever wondered why that was called the laundry, that's why. Probably never thought of it, right? But if you had a tour on the estate, you see, you would have wondered that. And she was fully supportive of his effort to do that, and in spite of the fact that he was criticized, Garrett was criticized for buying slaves. Doesn't that make you a slave owner? And he was
buying their freedom.
Yeah, buying their freedom, not their labor. Big difference. But critics kept bringing it up in the papers that Garrett Smith was buying more slaves, which he was. He did a lot of it. But one of the biggest critics was Lucretia Mott, who was a women's rights and abolitionist person. And she said, you're wasting money buying slaves because you're giving slaveholders more money to buy more slaves. What you really need to do is support the movement in other ways. Well, he didn't see it that way. So he went on doing it anyway. She also supported women's rights, Anne did. And this took a little bit of effort on her part because in order to support women's rights, you had to be somewhat deviant and assertive. You got it? That's tough for a person like Anne, who was a domestic servant, essentially, and has inculcated these rules that govern a domestic person in the home, that is supposed to be quiet and stay out of the limelight and don't get involved in politics and never say anything in public. Well, she was there too, and that's what the source of her dissonance was. But she did support women's rights in the long run because she felt the burn of it on her own life, the discrimination. And the discrimination against women, once again, let's say it, was extremely high. It was so high. Here, listen, here's an example. 1865, the Civil War is over, right? Now it's time to enfranchise black males. See, that's what the 15th Amendment did. The push to enfranchise black males interested women. Stanton, Anthony Gage, and others, they said, we want the word sex put in that amendment as well as color, so that there can be no discrimination in voting for either sex. This makes sense. Now is the time to do it. We have spent 4 years soft peddling our interest in women's rights in order to help you abolitionist guys win the war. Now help us. And they said, phooey. Wait your turn. Now, that's their words. Can you imagine Garrett Smith telling Elizabeth Cady Stanton to wait her turn? I'm surprised she didn't flatten his nose. I think she wanted to. But that's the way it was. And what they were saying was, if we put women in that amendment to the Constitution, it will never be ratified. Because the discrimination against women is too intense. No state will ratify the amendment if we do this. If we leave women out of it and include just black males, it will get ratified. And unfortunately, they were right. Garrett Smith, Frederick Douglass, Garrison, Wendell Phillips, the big heads in the abolition movement said that. And it looked at the time like they were reneging on women's rights. It sounds like it, doesn't it? Well, yes, they were in a way, but they also had their finger on the American pulse enough to know that if they put it in there, they'd never get enfranchisement for anyone. Because no one would vote for women to be enfranchised at that time. They had to wait their turn. And it was another, what, 50 years? 1920 before it finally came about? 1917 in New York. Anyway, so that's how high the discrimination against women was. And as I'm sure you know, there is still a lot of it today. So we're still fighting these battles. The discrimination against women at that time was so intense that there was even an anti-women's rights movement led by women. Yeah, led by women who said, we have all the rights we want. We don't need any more rights. We're under the protection of our husbands. The word protection is a euphemism for dominance. That's what they were really saying. But they couldn't picture themselves with any power. They had no background for it. Could Anne? I mean, look where she grew up. Look what she went through in the slaveholding family. Look at her domestic role in Peterborough. How could she have any background to consider herself a powerful person? Voting? I don't need that. So the movement was there, and it shows how intense the discrimination was because many women were even in agreement with it. Elizabeth Cady Stanton called them the mummies of civilization. That's cute. Sort of an ossified attitude, you know. Well, Anne also supported dress reform. Now, this is her daughter, right? Elizabeth Smith Miller, and she was married in 1843. In 1851, she gets this idea. There's these big, you see them, balloon hoop skirts, full length, dragging on the ground, are inconvenient. I'm raising children. I find it difficult to carry kids or groceries or climb stairs or work in the garden with this thing on. You've got to have something different. And she had seen things before. She had traveled, and Oneida community was using a similar form of dress to what became bloomers. So she knew what it was, and she adopted it. She didn't really design it. I read frequently that Elizabeth Smith Miller designed bloomers. Well, she may have designed a type of dress that was different from a big gown, but she had seen it elsewhere and it was being used elsewhere. Water cures were using it, and she'd seen it overseas. And so she devised this thing with a short skirt and some pants underneath. Dress reform. Big deal. Well, it was then. Oh my. Women who adopted it were vilified in the press and in public by males, because what they were doing was challenging the domestic role that they were supposed to be carrying out, and challenging what it was that men preferred. And the standard of beauty at the time was these big skirts. And to think that what the women were saying, we want to change what we wear from what men prefer to what we want. And they said, no way. And they became so violent over it that after 6 or 7 years, the women who did adopt this costume, like Elizabeth Smith Miller and Stanton and Anthony and others, abandoned it. And the reason they abandoned it was they said, whenever we go to speak somewhere about women's rights wearing the bloomer costume, people are so angry at us they can't hear what we have to say. So they gave it up. But as you certainly know, it wasn't the end of dress reform. Just look around. Dress reform went miles beyond what they were saying, along with women's rights issues. But Anne was there. She was one of the earliest supporters of it, in fact. She was talking about the need for dress reform in the 1830s. Anne was. But she didn't have the guts to do it. She was stuck in that tradition of authority and male rule, and didn't have the guts to change her habit. So, although she supported it, she was again outside the institutional structure for actually producing reform. She was not a reformer in the way that the abolitionists were. They were after the institutions that supported it. Anne was not in that camp. So her reform work, if you can call it that, was aimed at herself, her family, her local community, and didn't go much beyond that. And how come? And we've been over enough of it, I think, to understand it already, but I think we can summarize it by saying she didn't become involved in institutional reform work because she was living while female. You know the idea of driving while drunk and what that does? Some people say they become targets of the police because they're living while black, and she was living while female. And that was a deterrent to reform activity at the time. This was men's work. And she'd grown up on that plantation. She was stuck in religious morals that depended on authority instead of individual independence. She was dependent upon powerful males. She was facing that intense discrimination against women. All of these things, she put them together, and it dampened her intent to have any assertiveness in reform circles. A sad story in a way, isn't it? But not untypical of females at the time. The ones that did stand out and shout loudly, you know, the Stantons and Anthonys, Elizabeth Smith Miller in some ways, the Grimke sisters, if you've ever heard of them, and so on as Lucretia Mott, they paid high. They paid dearly for that in reputation. Although they became powerful people in the long run, they were vilified at the time, and Anne wasn't about to do that. Now, what did she do that we could emulate? Certainly her benevolence was, she spent much time in her village, Peterborough, trying to help people who were in need. She'd visit local residents, inquire as to their needs, and then hand them some money to take care of it. And there are stories in the letters of local residents weeping after Anne's visit because they now were capable of doing what they needed to do for their children. She supported the work in the local home for destitute children, which was there in Peterborough. And she certainly supported the notion of we would recognize as diversity, cultural diversity. the runaway slaves that came through her home, sat at her table. Peterborough was one of the first truly integrated societies in the United States, in which people, black and white, lived together, worked together, worshiped together, played together, ate together. Garrett Smith had the letters in his files of people who wrote back to him saying, "I'll never come to your house again because you had black people at your table, dinner table." So it was an innovation in ways that Anne was a part of and accepted, and a lovely one as we see it. So that's Anne Carroll Fitzhugh Smith. Do you have any questions for me? Yes?
One quick question. Peter, there's no railroad, there's no canal.
How come it's there?
How come it's there?
That's a frequent question. Well, we have a T-shirt. Maybe you've seen it. We sell. In front of it says, "Where is Peterborough?" The back of it says, "Just south of Clockville," and then, or just west of Siloam, and east of Fenner. Well, I know where it is. Yeah, and it's still that way. And there are no
Not far from Marysville.
there are no major connections to Peterborough. There are no highways that go through it, no railroads, no canals, no throughway, and there never have been. So why is it so important? And it's probably one of the more important locations in American history regarding human rights activity in the two social movements of abolition of women's rights. And the reason, of course, is Garrett Smith and his money. That's why. Now, why is Peterborough where it is? That's Peter. Peter Smith, in 1793, leased from the Native Americans 50,000 acres right through here in central New York. And shortly after he leased it, a couple of years later, the state of New York bought it from the Native Americans. And Peter then, in order to maintain land sales, had to buy it back from the state, which he did. But the state's purchase was illegal, so therefore we have Native American land claims. That was quick. That was too quick. But I'm not going to go through all the legals of it. But that's why we have Native American land claims, because the state of New York illegally bought the land from the Native Americans. The U.S. Constitution had already been ratified, specifying that no state could write treaties with foreign nations. New York State did it, and it was an illegal act, and it still is. So the Native Americans still have legal claim to that 50,000 acres, which is right here. That's why when you buy land within that tract, you have to sign a caveat that says you understand that the Native Americans still hold title to your land. That's why. Peter did that. That's an important book. I mean, his importance in central New York history is huge, and nothing had ever been done about him. I couldn't understand why. But when he did that, when he started to develop the land in this 50,000 acre tract, he wanted to build a residence for himself in the middle of it. That's why Peterborough is where it is. It was the top of a hill, and it was about in the middle of this 50,000 acres, which went both ways. So it was a long, narrow strip. So that's why it's there. Other questions? Yes?
What was the age difference between Garrett and Anne?
Garrett was born in 1797, Anne in 1805. So they were 8 years apart. He died in 1874, December 28th, late in 1874. She was healthy at the time, except for a minor problem with an eye. She had her two biggest physical ailments that were real in life were disordered bowels and an eye problem that was recurrent. And
Probably from washing with that dirty water.
who knows? But she died 3 months after he did. He died in December 28, 1874. She died on March 6th, 1875. And I gotta tell you this is embarrassing, but in the Practical Dreamer, I speculated one thing. I don't put undocumented work in my books. Everything is documented as fact, and you can go find out where I got it from if you want to. I mean, it's clear. But I made a speculation, and I said so clearly, that this is an undocumented speculation. She died on March 6th, 1875. March 6th was Garrett's birthday.
Oh, wow.
And there was nothing wrong with her physically. I speculated that she committed suicide in order to be with him because she believed so intensely in the afterlife, and she gave him the best birthday present she could think of. That's not what happened. I know that now, but only after a lot more digging. I found out that in early March, she acquired what was clearly in the symptoms that I can read, appendicitis. She died of peritonitis. That's the statement in her death record, which is a massive infection of the peritoneal cavity of the intestine layer. The intestine bursts and spills into the peritoneal cavity its contents, which is infectious. And the massive infection kills. And that's what she died of. And I speculated that she did it with arsenic. Arsenic was a common household product in those days. It was around a lot for use in the house and for use in animals as an antibiotic, especially for horses. And so that was there. And Green Smith had bags full of it for preserving his birds. They were preserved, their skins were preserved with arsenic. So I knew it was there. But I did find out that, at least as I interpret the symptoms, that she had appendicitis, which produced peritonitis. So that's revised. Yes?
How much help did she have running her household?
Oh, good question. A lot. Yeah, that's why she was idle. She could spend months at a time going to water cures and movement cures because she didn't have to be there. She had hired help that raised the children, cleaned the house, made the meals, washed the dishes, everything. They had in-house servants, women. As far as I know, they were all women that did this. They did have in-house male servants that took care of the fireplaces. But some were highly employed in rearing the children, others in making meals. So she didn't have to do this. And she called herself useless, quote. She would sign her letters to Garrett, "Your useless wife." Now that is sad, isn't it? Really, that is sad. A sad perspective on oneself. No wonder she was depressed. No wonder she wanted to run away. She called herself your runaway wife. She'd sign that way. And she'd go away. She'd go away for these health cures for like 3 or 4 months at a time. On an average, she was away from home 1/4 of every year.
Wow.
3 months a year. And she hoped that she'd feel better when she came back. But the way it went was, I'm sure I'll feel better once I get away from Peterborough. And once she was away for a while, she said, I'm sure I'll feel better when I get back to Peterborough. It was, you know, spinning around. And there wasn't anything wrong in the first place, probably. Maggots in her brain, right? That's what Garrett told her. Yes, sir.
What was the largest number of children that they had at any single time?
Oh, good question. I'm not sure I can
I was
answer
trying
that.
to do the math and like
Yeah.
keep up with the dates on that.
In the early 1830s, they had the 8 children from the Cochrane family in their house,
Was their own too?
plus their own. And Elizabeth was born in 1822, so she was there. Fitzhugh was born in 1824, and he lived to age 12, so he was there.
Right.
So they had at least 2 of their own.
Did they take in 3 and then 1 more?
Yep. And that was in just ensuing years. So those children,
I'm talking 14 children.
those other families' children were there while their children were there too. Yeah.
Wow. Had a lot of veterans.
Yep. At one point, Elizabeth, their daughter, she was the firstborn, she went to what was called Hampton. It was the home of the Fitzhughs in Rochester. As she put it, the hubbub of so many children at home was too much for me. So it did get to them at times. Yeah.
Escape.
You said the children were there for 3 years. Where did they go afterwards?
Back to their father. Yeah. He finally determined that he was in a position where he could accept his own children back home.
Did Garrett ever feel that the home needed security?
Yes, he did. I mean, his house in
Yeah.
Peterborough. Once in a while, but it was rare. Yeah, once in a while he would hire armed guards, but it was very rare. I'm only aware of a couple of times, and that was when slave catchers were on the trail of runaways, and sometimes local residents would help him guard his home. The whole community was supportive of what he was doing. Well, I can't say whole, that's an absolute. Most of the community were in support of what he was doing and would back him up on the protection of his family and the runaways. What else we got?
Was she educated at all at home before she got married?
Yes, there were tutors in the Fitzhugh home, as there were tutors in her home for her kids. Yeah, it was minimal. Minimal. I don't know how to put it. Probably something like a 6th to 8th grade education, something like that.
Was Garrett in favor of educating women?
Yes, he was. Garrett was very much in favor of educating women. He supported a number of schools that did so with his philanthropy, yes.
How did Peterborough get its name? Was it
Peter Smith. And Smithfield. Peter Smith. He moved from Utica to Peterborough in January of 1807 and named it himself. Named it for himself. And he, all of his life, even after he left Peterborough in 1820, which was just after Elizabeth, his wife, died. And even after that, he moved from Peterborough. He ended up in Schenectady for the rest of his life. And right till the end of his life, which was 1837, he always signed his name, Peter Smith of Peterborough. So I call it a self-coronation. He never let go of the identity with Peterborough.
Okay, so Garrett Smith's got all this money.
Yeah.
He dies. She
Right.
dies 2 months later. Green and Elizabeth get the money.
Yeah.
Where's all the money?
Mm-hmm. Fair question. What happened to the family fortune?
Yeah.
When Garrett died, he divided it into 3 parts. 1/2 to his wife Ann, and 1/4 each to his 2 children. She dies 3 months later, and her half goes to the 2 children. Now what happens to it? Do you know what the word amortized means? You spend it up. They spend it. They spend it. Especially Green. Green was extravagant. He only lived 5 years after his father and mother died. But he and his wife Bessie spent about $1 million a year on themselves. $1 million in our terms. And I traced that through records in his papers, the receipts, payments out, you can add it all up. And, yeah, about $1 million a year.
And they had no children.
And they had no children, correct. Bessie was his cousin. Her name was Fitzhugh. They
Now, was he
married.
living in Peterborough too? Green?
Green, he did for a while. When he got sick with pulmonary issues, he always had what I think we would call fibromyalgia. Connective tissue and joint pain, to the point where they called it rheumatism at the time, to the point where sometimes he couldn't physically move for weeks. He'd lie in bed because he couldn't get up and walk. It was that bad. He'd always had that. But He died in 1880. It was about 1877 that he began to experience pulmonary issues, lungs. And it got slowly worse, and then it'd get a little better. He'd go to New York or Philadelphia for treatment, but really nobody knew what to do. There weren't the right drugs. And it got worse and worse and worse, and finally in July of 1880, he died of TB. It's progressed steadily. During that time, he spent a phenomenal amount of money while he was ill. And even before that, because of the joint pain problems, he became itinerant. And he searched. He traveled around searching for medical help for his problems. And he lived, he eventually found a doctor in Kensington, which is just outside of Chicago, and another one in Florida that he thought were helping him with his pain problems. And he'd spend a third of the year in Chicago, a third of the year in Homosassa, Florida, and a third of the year, summer, in Peterborough. And so he jumped around like that for several years, and eventually died in Peterborough. He died in the birdhouse. The birdhouse is this building I put on the cover. It's gone now. It fell down in the early 1970s. Excuse me. And that's in which he had his collection. And he had a lot. He had many prizes that he won at shooting contests. He was the national champion in trap shooting. And he won all kinds of ribbons and goblets and badges for those things. They were all on display in that building. And he went, when he got to the point where he knew he was going to die. He'd been to New York City for treatment and it wasn't doing any good. He came home to die. And he went to the birdhouse. And he had a room in the birdhouse and a bed. And he finished up the writing of the catalog, the log of all of his birds, just a few days before he died. July of 1880, yeah.
Did Ann ever spend time in Saratoga, New York? Saratoga Springs? Because I know they're well known for their spas in that area.
I think she did. The water cure movement was there. And I'd have to go back and look again, but I believe she did. She traveled all over the place, seeking these miracle cures. Very susceptible to that idea.
You talk about Green's building falling in the 70s. Was anything saved from that building?
Yeah, the birds were donated by his wife Bessie to Colgate, Cornell, and Harvard. Their ornithological collections to get the programs going, actually. The contents, I don't know what happened to the rest of the contents of the building. I've often questioned that. He had a lot of mementos of his hunting days, deer heads and racks, and there were boats hanging from the ceiling, canoes. I don't know what happened to those things. I did find he collected birds to mount. How do you collect birds to mount? You shoot them. Like Audubon did, People said, oh, they were shooting songbirds. Yeah. But at the time it was scientific research. And it was approved of. And he shot thousands of birds with a 10-gauge outside hammer, double-barrel shotgun. Weighs 12 pounds. A huge, huge piece. And believe it or not, I own it. I knew who had it because the guy that owned it was up in Buffalo, and he contacted us at Peterborough just to let us know that he had that gun. But he said he's not selling it. He was a collector. I'm not selling it, he said. So I said, well, when you come to Peterborough, he was coming for a visit, bring it. I want to see it. So he did. And I had seen it. Well, the guy got hard up for money. That does it, And he put the gun in an auction, of all things. And I called him. I said, I know the gun is in that auction. You said you'd give me first refusal. He said, well, I had a chance to get a lot of money for it if it went to public auction. especially because of the name associated. And there was a solid gold plate on the stock of the gun about that big. It says Greensmith, Peterborough, New York, engraved in
Oh,
gold.
my God.
And he said, I thought I could get a lot of money for it. Well, the auction house put it in their catalog. I saw it. I sent in a bid. And then I got a note from the auction house that the gun had been removed from auction because it has an ivory bead. The bead is, maybe that big around, but it's on the barrel. It's the rear sight on the shotgun, and it's illegal to sell ivory in the United States. Therefore, the gun cannot be sold at auction, and they sent it back to the owner. Then he called me, and we bartered.
Wow.
Eventually, it'll go in the museum. I mean, I don't want it. It's just, rather than let it go somewhere else, it ought to come home.
Yeah.
So, the problem right now is that the Peterborough Museum isn't secure.
Yeah.
So I don't know. Eventually, it'll go there. I hope.
I was
And thank you for coming.
And thank